Skeptic and Barbarian. If it is not hard to imagine all humanity in the grip of convulsions, or at least of fear, it would be an overestimate of the race to suppose it can ever raise itself as a whole to the level of doubt, generally reserved for a few elite outcasts. Yet humanity exceeds to doubt, in part, during those rare moments when it changes gods, and when men's minds, subject to contradictory solicitations, no longer know which cause to defend, which truth to adopt. When Christianity burst upon Rome, the slaves appropriated it without hesitation. The patricians resisted, needing time to shift from aversion to curiosity, from curiosity to fervor. Imagine a reader of the Pyrrhonian Hypotyposes faced with the Gospels. What artifice could reconcile not two doctrines, but two universes? How greet ingenuous parables when one is grappling with the ultimate perplexities of the intellect? The treatises in which Sextus Empiricus, early in the 3rd century AD, reckoned up all the ancient world's doubts, are an exhaustive compilation of the unbreathable, the most dizzying pages ever written, and, it must be said, the most boring. Too subtle and too methodical to complete with the new superstitions, they were the expression of a world already consummated, futureless, doomed. Yet skepticism, whose theses they had codified, managed to survive a while on lost positions, until the day when Christians and barbarians joined forces to reduce and abolish it. A civilization begins by myth and ends in doubt, a theoretical doubt which, once it turns against itself, becomes quite practical. No civilization can begin by questioning values it has not yet created. Once produced, it wearies of them and weans itself away, examines and weighs them with a devastating detachment. For the various beliefs it had engendered, and which now break adrift, it substitutes a system of uncertainties. It organizes its metaphysical shipwreck, with amazing success when a Sextus is on hand to help. In the twilight of antiquity, skepticism possessed a dignity it was not to regain in the Renaissance, despite a Montaigne, not even in the 18th century, despite a Hume. Pascal alone, had he so desired, might have saved, might have rehabilitated it. But he turned away, leaving skepticism to straggle in the margin of modern philosophy. Today, when we too are about to change gods, will there be sufficient respite for us to cultivate it? Will it find itself back in favor, or, on the contrary, banned outright? Will it be smothered by the tumult of dogmas? The important thing, though, is not to ascertain whether it is threatened from without, but if we can genuinely cultivate it, if our powers permit us to confront without succumbing to it. For before being the problem of civilization, skepticism is an individual case, and as such, concerns us without respect to the historical expression it assumes. In order to live, in order merely to breathe, we must make the extravagant effort to believe that the world, or our concepts, contain a basis of truth. As soon as the effort fails for one reason or another, we relapse into that state of pure indetermination where, since any certainty whatever seems to us a deviation, every resolution, all that the mind advances or proclaims, assumes the aspect of a divagation. Every affirmation appears risky or degrading, as does every negation. It is incontestably strange, no less than pitiable, to reach this point, when, for years, we have applied ourselves with some success to surmounting doubt, to recovering from it. But it is a disease no one is ever cured of altogether, if he has really contracted it. And indeed, it is a relapse that is in question here. First of all, it was a mistake to put affirmation and negation on the same plane. To deny, granted, is to affirm in reverse. Yet there is something more in negation, an additional anxiety, a determination to be singular, and, in a sense, an anti-natural element. Nature, supposing it knew itself and could attain to formulation, would elaborate an endless series of existential judgments. Only the mind possesses the faculty of refusing what exists, of thriving on what does not. Only the mind fabricates absence. I become aware of myself, indeed I am, only when I deny. As soon as I affirm, I become interchangeable and behave as an object. The no having presided over the partition of primordial unity, an inveterate and unwholesome pleasure attaches to any form of negation, essential or frivolous. We rack our brains to demolish reputations, God's first of all. But it must be said to our credit that we strive even harder to destroy our own, by putting our truths in question and discrediting them, by effecting in ourselves the shift from negation to doubt. Whereas we always negate in the name of something external to our negation, doubt, without availing itself of anything which transcends it, draws on its own conflicts, on that war reason declares against itself, when, exasperated beyond endurance, it attacks and overthrows its own foundations in order to escape the absurdity of having to affirm or deny anything at all. While reason is thus opposing itself, we make ourselves into judges. We imagine we may examine or counter reason in the name of a self on which it has no hold, or of which it is merely an accident, without realizing that it is logically impossible for us to set ourselves above reason in order to acknowledge or contest its validity, for there is no proceeding superior to reason, no pronouncement which does not emanate from it. Yet in practice it seems as if, by a subterfuge or a miracle, we manage to free ourselves from its categories and its shackles. Is the exploit so unheard of? It comes down to an extremely simple phenomenon. Anyone who is carried away by his reasoning forgets that he is using reason, and this forgetting is the condition of all creative thought, indeed of thought itself. As long as we follow the mind's spontaneous movement, as long as, by reflection, we put ourselves on the level of life itself, we cannot think that we are thinking. Once we do so, our ideas oppose each other, neutralize each other within an empty consciousness. This state of sterility, in which we neither advance nor retreat, this exceptional form of marking time, is precisely where doubt leads us, a state which in many respects is related to the acidi of the mystics. We had expected to realize the definitive, to establish ourselves in the ineffable. Instead, we are cast into the uncertain, devoured by the insipid. Everything frays in the intellect's self-torsion, a kind of furious stupor. Doubt crashes down upon us like a calamity. Far from choosing it, we fall into it. And try as we will to wrest ourselves from it, to conjure it away, doubt never loses sight of us, for it is not even true that doubt crashes down upon us. Doubt was within us, and we were foredoomed to it. No one chooses the lack of choice, nor strives to opt for the absence of option, for nothing that affects us deeply is willed. We are free to invent torments for ourselves, but they are no more than posture, attitude. Only those torments count which emerge from us in spite of ourselves. Only the inevitable counts, which proceeds from our weaknesses and our ordeals, in short, from our impossibilities. True doubt will never be deliberate, even in its elaborated form. It is merely the speculative disguise assumed by our intolerance for being. Hence, when it seizes us, and we suffer its pangs, There is nothing whose non-existence we cannot conceive. We must posit a self-destructive principle of conceptual essence if we would understand the process by which reason manages to undermine its foundations, to devour itself. Not content to declare certainty impossible, it excludes even the notion of certainty. It will go further still and reject any form of evidence, for evidence originates in being, from which reason has severed itself, and this severance engenders, defines, and consolidates doubt. Every judgment, even a negative one, is rooted in the immediate, or implies a self-imposed blindness, without which reason finds nothing manifest to hold on to. The more resistant reason is to obscuring itself, the more it considers any one proposition as gratuitous and void as the next. Since the least adherence, assent in any form, seems to reason inexplicable, unheard of, supernatural, it will cultivate the uncertain and extend its range with a zeal which includes a touch of vice and, curiously, of vitality. This delights the skeptic, for without this panting quest of the improbable, which betrays, after all, a certain complicity with life, he would be no more than a ghost. Though he is quite prepared to espouse the spectral state, since he must doubt till there is no longer any matter for doubt, till everything fades and crumbles, and till, identifying even vertigo with a vestige of evidence, with a simulacrum of certainty, he will perceive with murderous acuity the bankruptcy of the inanimate as of the organic, and singularly of our faculties, which, through him, will betray their own pretensions and inadequacies. Anyone who cherishes the equilibrium of his mind will avoid attacking certain essential superstitions. This is a vital necessity for thinking, despised only by the skeptic, who, having nothing to preserve, respects neither the secrets nor the taboos indispensable to the duration of certitudes. Certitudes, indeed. The function he claims is to forage in them, to reveal their origin, and to compromise them, to identify the datum on which they are based, and which, upon inspection, turns out to be inseparable from illusion or hypothesis. Nor will he be more sparing of mystery, in which he discerns only a limit which men, out of timidity or sloth, have assigned to their interrogations and their anxieties. Here, as in all things, what this anti-fanatic pursues with intolerance is the ruin of the inviolable. Because negation is an aggressive, impure doubt, an inverted dogmatism, it rarely denies itself, rarely frees itself from its frenzies. Doubt, on the other hand, frequently, even inevitably, calls itself in question, prefers to abolish itself rather than see its perplexities degenerate into articles of faith. Since all things are indeed equal, how would these perplexities merit escaping that universal equivalence which necessarily renders them null and void? If the skeptic made an exception for them, he would condemn himself, jeopardize his theses. Determined to remain faithful to them, and to suffer the consequences, he will arrive at the abandonment of all investigation, the discipline of abstention, the suspension of judgment. He will no longer bother to classify or to grade the truths whose principle he had envisaged and so pitilessly analyzed. To which of them, moreover, could he accord preference, when the point for him is in fact to prefer nothing, never again to convert an opinion into a conviction? As for opinions themselves, he may indulge them only capriciously, only from the need to belittle himself in his own eyes. Why this rather than that? He will adopt this ancient, ever-corrosive refrain of the doubters, a motto which spares nothing, not even death, which is too decisive, too assured for his taste, stamped with elementalism, a flaw it is inherited from life. Suspension of judgment represents the philosophical counterpart of irresolution, the recipe borrowed in order to express itself by a will incapable of choosing anything but an absence which excludes every scale of values and every obligatory criterion. One step more, and this absence is joined by another, the absence of sensations. Once the mind's activity is suspended, why not suspend that of the senses, even that of the blood? No object, no obstacle or choice to evade or to confront. Preserved both from the servitude of perception and from action, the self, triumphing over its functions, shrinks to a point of consciousness projected into the infinite, outside of time. Since every form of expansion implies a thirst for the irrevocable, we can scarcely conceive of a conqueror who would suspend his judgment. Doubt does not cross the Rubicon. Doubt never crosses anything. Its logical conclusion is an absolute inaction, an extremity conceivable in theory, inaccessible in fact. Of all the skeptics, only a Pyrrho has really approached it. The rest have made more or less happy stabs in its direction. This is because skepticism has against it our reflexes, our appetites, our instincts. For all its declarations that being is a prejudice, this prejudice, older than ourselves, outdates man and life, resists our attacks, withstands reasoning and proof, since it is also true that whatever exists and manifests itself in duration is based on the undemonstrable, on the unverifiable. One must either adopt Keats's remark, "The truth is, there is something real in the world," or be exiled from action forever. However, the certainty expressed here is not imperious enough to possess dynamic virtues. In order to act effectively, one must also believe in the reality of good and evil, in their distinct and autonomous existence. If we identify them both with conventions, their individualizing contours blur. No good or evil action, hence no action at all, so that things, like the judgments we bring to bear upon them, cancel each other out in a bleak identity. A value we know to be arbitrary ceases to be a value and sinks to a fiction. With fictions, there is no way of instituting a morality, still less rules of behavior in the present. Whence, in order to escape confusion, the duty incumbent upon us to restore good and evil to their rights, to save them and save ourselves, at the price of our clear-sightedness. It is the doubter in us who keeps us from showing our capacity. It is the doubter who, by imposing upon us the burden of lucidity, overtaxes us, exhausts us, and abandons us to our disappointments, after having abused our capacities for questioning and for rejection. In a sense, any doubt is disproportionate to our powers. To ours alone, a suffering God, as has been seen, is normal enough. A doubting God is as wretched as we are. Hence, for all their merits, their exemplary legitimacy, we never consider our doubts without a certain dread, even when we have taken a certain pleasure in conceiving them. The intractable skeptic, barricaded within his system, seems to us a man unbalanced by an excess of rigor, a lunatic crazed by an incapacity to divagate. On the philosophic level, no one more honest, but his very honesty has something monstrous about it. Nothing finds favor in his eyes. Everything seems to him an approximation and an appearance, our graphs as well as our groans. His drama is to be unable to condescend to imposture, as we all do when we assert or deny, when we have the impudence to produce any opinion whatever. And because he is incurably honest, he discovers a lie wherever an opinion attacks indifference and triumphs over it. To live is equivalent to the impossibility of abstaining. To conquer this impossibility is the excessive task he imposes on himself, the task he faces in solitary, for mutual abstention. The collective suspension of judgment is unfeasible. If it were not, what an opportunity for humanity to make an honorable end! But what has scarcely fallen into the individual lot will in no way do so to the general, the crowd being barely capable of reaching the threshold of negation. Since doubt turns out to be incompatible with life, the consistent, persistent skeptic, that living dead man, crowns his career by a defeat unparalleled in any other intellectual adventure. Furious to have sought singularity, and to have delighted in doing so, he will aspire to effacement, to anonymity. And this, oh paradox, precisely when he no longer feels an affinity with anything, anyone. To model himself upon the commonplace is all he hopes for at this point of his collapse, where he reduces wisdom to conformism and salvation to conscious illusion, to postulated illusion. In other words, to the acceptance of appearances as such. But he forgets that appearances are a recourse only if one is sufficiently benighted to assimilate them to realities, only if one benefits from naive illusion, illusion unaware of itself, precisely the kind which is the prerogative of others, and of which he alone lacks the secret. Instead of accepting the fact, he, the enemy of imposture and philosophy, will undertake to cheat in life, convinced that by dint of dissimulations and frauds, he will manage not to distinguish himself from the rest of humanity, whom he will vainly try to imitate. Vainly, since every act requires him to combat the thousand motives he has for not performing it. The least of his gestures will be concerted, the result of attention and of a strategy, as if he had to take every moment by assault, unable to plunge into it naturally. Having dislocated being, he struggles desperately to restore it. Like Macbeth's, his conscience is ravaged. He too has murdered sleep, the sleep in which certainties took their rest. They waken and come to haunt him, to disturb him, and they disturb him indeed, but since he does not stoop to remorse, he contemplates the procession of his victims with a discomfort assuaged by irony. What do these ghostly recriminations matter to him now? Detached from his enterprises and from his crimes, he has reached deliverance, but a deliverance without salvation, prelude to the integral experience of vacuity, which he approaches when, having doubted his doubts, he ends by doubting himself, by depreciating and hating himself, by no longer believing in his destroyer's mission. Once the last link is broken, the one which attached him to himself, and without which even self-destruction is impossible, he will seek refuge in primordial vacancy, in the most intimate of origins, before that friction between seed and substance which extends through the entire series of beings, from the insect to the most tormented of mammals. Since neither life nor death any longer excites his mind, he is less real than those shades to whose reproaches he has just been subjected. Not one subject any longer intrigues him, which he would raise to the dignity of a problem, a scourge. His incuriosity attains to such breadth that it borders on total relinquishment, a nothingness more denuded than that on which the mystics pride themselves, or lament after their peregrinations across the desert of divinity. Amid his seamless hebitude, a single thought still agonizes him, a single question, stupid, laughable, obsessive. What did God do when he did nothing? How did he spend before the creation his terrible leisure? If he speaks to God as an equal, it is because they are both at the same degree of stagnation and futility. When his senses wither for lack of objects that might solicit them, and his reason ceases to function from the horror of passing judgment, he has reached the point where he can address himself only to the non-creator, whom he resembles, with whom he identifies himself, and whose all, indiscernible from nothing, is the space where, sterile and exhausted, he fulfills himself. He rests. Beside the rigorous, or one might say orthodox skeptic, whose lamentable and in certain respects grandiose end we have just seen, there exists another, heretical, capricious, who, while suffering doubt only intermittently, is capable of conceiving it to the last and of drawing its ultimate consequences. He too will know the suspension of judgment and the abolition of sensations, but only within a crisis, which he will surmount by projecting into the indetermination in which he sees himself cast, a content and a frisson it seemed incapable of affording. Leaping outside the aporias in which his mind vegetated, he shifts from inertia to exaltation. He raises himself to a hallucinated enthusiasm which would turn even the mineral itself lyrical, if there were still minerals in his world. No consistency anywhere. Everything is transfigured, everything vanishes. He alone remains, confronting a triumphal void. Free of the world's shackles, and of understandings as well, he too compares himself to God, this time a God who will be brimming, excessive, intoxicated, plunged into the ecstasies of creation, and whose privileges he will adopt, stricken with the sudden omniscience, a miraculous moment when the possible, deserting the future, will dissolve into the moment, enlarging it, dilating it to the bursting point. Whereupon this skeptic sui generis fears nothing so much as to fall back into another crisis. At least it will be permissible for him to consider from outside the doubt over which he has momentarily triumphed, contrary to the other kind, who has hooked himself upon it forever. Further, he possesses another advantage, that of being able to open himself to experiences of another order, to those of religious minds especially, which utilize and exploit doubt, make it a stage, a provisional but indispensable hell, in order to embark upon the absolute and take anchor there. These are the traitors to skepticism, whose example he would like to follow. Insofar as he succeeds, he glimpses that the abolition of sensations can lead to something besides an impasse. When Sariputta, one of the Buddha's disciples, exclaims, "Nirvana is bliss," and when the objection is raised that there can be no bliss where there are no sensations, Sariputta answers, "Bliss is precisely that there is no sensation." This paradox is no longer one for the man who, despite his tribulations and his attrition, still has enough resources to join being on the borders of the void, and to vanquish, even if only for brief intervals, that appetite for unreality, out of which appears the irrefragable clarity of doubt, which can be opposed only by extra-rational evidence, conceived by another appetite, the appetite for what is real. Yet, taking advantage of the slightest weakness, the refrain, "Why this rather than that?" returns, and its insistence and its repetition cast consciousness into an accursed timelessness, into a frozen becoming, whereas any yes, and even a no, make that consciousness participate in the substance of time from which they emanate, and which they proclaim. Every affirmation, and, with all the more reason, every belief, proceeds from a depth of barbarism which the majority, which virtually the totality of men have the good fortune to preserve, and which only the skeptic, once again the true skeptic, the consistent one, has lost or liquidated, so that he retains only vague vestiges of it, too weak to influence his behavior or the conduct of his ideas. Hence, if there exist isolated skeptics in each period, skepticism, as a historical phenomenon, is to be met with only at the moments when a civilization no longer has a soul, in the sense Plato gives the word, what moves of itself. In the absence of any principle of movement, how could it still have a present, how especially a future? And just as the skeptic, at the end of his sapper's labor, reached a downfall like the one he had reserved for certitudes, so a civilization, after having undermined its values, collapses with them, and falls into a deliquescence in which barbarism appears the only remedy, as is evidenced by the apostrophe flung at the Romans by Salvianus early in the 5th century. There is not one of your cities which is pure, unless it is those in which the barbarians dwell. In this case, it was perhaps less a matter of licentiousness than of perplexity. Licentiousness, even debauchery, is becoming to a civilization, or at least a civilization adapts itself to them. But perplexity, once it spreads, terrorizes a civilization, which will turn to those who escape it, who are immune to it, and it is then that the barbarian begins to seduce, to fascinate delicate minds, minds in conflict who envy and admire him, sometimes openly, more often in secret, and crave, without always admitting it to themselves, to become his slaves. That they also fear him is undeniable, but this fear, in no way salutary, contributes rather to their future subjection, weakens them, paralyzes them, and drives them deeper into their scruples, their impasses. For them, abdication, their sole solution, involves less a suspension of judgment than a suspension of will, not so much the defeat of reason as the defeat of the organs. At this stage, skepticism is inseparable from physiological infirmity. A robust organism rejects and shuns it. A debile constitution yields to it, rushes upon it. And if that constitution should then try to free itself, since it cannot succeed by its own means, it will seek the help of the barbarian, whose role is not to solve but to suppress problems, and with them the hyperacute consciousness inherent in them, which torments the weak man even when he has renounced all speculative activity. For within this consciousness is perpetuated a morbid, an irrepressible need anterior to any theoretical perplexity, the weak man's need to multiply himself in laceration, suffering, and frustration, the need to be cruel, not to others, but to himself. Reason, instead of serving him as a means of release, becomes an instrument of self-torture. It affords him arguments against himself. It justifies his will to fail. It flatters him, exhausts itself in making his existence intolerable. And it is indeed in a desperate effort against himself that he urges his enemy to come and deliver him from his final agony. The barbarian phenomenon, which ineluctably appears at certain historical junctures, is perhaps an evil, but a necessary evil. Further, the methods employed to combat it precipitate its advent, since, in order to be effective, they must be ferocious, which is what civilization is unwilling to lend itself to. Should it be willing, it would not succeed for lack of vigor. The best thing for it, once on the decline, is to grovel before the barbarian. Moreover, no civilization is reluctant to do this, knowing too well that the barbarian represents, that he already incarnates, the future. Once the empire was invaded, its literary men, one thinks of an Apollinaris Sidonius, an Enodonius, a Cassiodorus, quite naturally became the panegyrists of the Gothic kings. The rest, the great mass of the conquered, took refuge in administration, or agriculture, for they had gone too soft to be permitted a career of arms. Converted to Christianity out of lassitude, they were incapable of ensuring its triumph by themselves. The conquerors gave them a hand. A religion is nothing by itself. Its fate depends on those who adopt it. The new gods demand new men, capable, in any circumstance, of decision, of choice, of saying firmly yes or no, instead of floundering in quibbles or becoming anemic by abuse of nuance. Since the virtues of barbarians consist precisely in the power of taking sides, of affirming or denying, they will always be celebrated by declining periods. The nostalgia for barbarism is the last word of a civilization, and thereby of skepticism. At the expiration of a cycle, what else can a disenchanted mind dream of but the impulse of brutes to count on the possible, to wallow in it? Unsuited to defend the doubts it no longer practices, or to subscribe to the dawning dogmas it despises, such a mind applauds supreme secession of the intellect, the irrefutable demonstrations of instinct. The Greek mind bows before the Roman, which in its turn will bow before the Goth, according to an inexorable rhythm, a law which history eagerly illustrates, today even more than at the beginning of the Christian era. The combat is unequal between the peoples who argue and the peoples who keep still, all the more in that the former, having eroded their vitality in cavilling, feel drawn to the latter's coarseness and silence. If this is true of a collectivity, what can we say of an individual, especially of the skeptic? Indeed, we must not be surprised to find him, specialist in subtlety though he is, at the heart of the ultimate solitude to which he has come, turning himself into a friend and accomplice of the hordes.